Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Hausman, and I am the president of the Root Day Virtual Learning Institute. And joining me for today's presentation, the one who's actually going to be doing the presentation, is my colleague, David Martino, who is, I think you're just really going to enjoy hearing what he has to say about today's topic around AI, which is how to approach AI from a mission perspective. So before we do get into the presentation itself, we always like to start with a quick prayer. And so that is my role in this before I turn it over to David. So under the circumstances of what's been happening throughout the world, I've been choosing to use the prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi for all of my meetings, and I think it's appropriate that we do so again today. So with that, in the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And when there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I might not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love, for it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardon that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Okay. So, once again, welcome, and thank you for being here. So at this point in the presentation, I literally just going to move it over to David Martino, and he takes it from here. So my job is done. Thank you all again for being here. David, do you want to take it on?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this, our third in this series on AI and Catholic education. So the question for this final presentation started as, how might we approach AI for mission? That question sort of forked into two distinct areas of consideration, both which are connected. They're like two stars in a constellation. Alone, they're not as substantial and don't form quite the full image as when they're together. But they're both substantial enough that I've separated them for the purpose of today. I've put in a question, a Q&A at the end of number one. And if we are sort of full in talking about that, we will sort of forward consideration of number two to a later date. We'll get a fourth webinar on the go. But if we're moving well and we will get to that last, the second half of this. So the first point of consideration is, really around creating a listening culture in the age of AI. So using AI to explore perspective and bias in order to foster mission-healthy classrooms, dispositions that are oriented to behaviors that support and are the practice of mission values. And then the second is, correlated, how do we use AI to foster greater differentiation in teaching and assessment? But specifically to call out and call upon a recognition of people's needs as an affirmation of the difference in our rooms and of the people, honoring the people before us, as part of building trust in our classrooms, which then falls back into the experience of the listening culture, and they sort of move together. Again, so these are sort of two parts. In number one, I'll talk exclusively about ChatGPT and there just to some degree. And in the second, I'll talk a bit about ChatGPT, also Hamada, which is another AI tool. And there's a third, if we get to, that I'll talk a little bit more about and tell maybe a funny anecdote about that one. So the question, I guess simply put, the short answer to how do we do this is, we amplify the human experience and we wrap that around and hold AI, our use of AI, with those very human hands. Some key elements that we're going to want to just highlight here. I'm just going to super quick set that timer to go. Okay. First, mission. Mission is broad and can be understood in a lot of ways. We're going to sort of loosely use it to mean the formation of the whole person, of the student, through education in a way that informs action. And that kind of comes out of some work that maybe some other folks who are here today did in the recent past with Father Johnny Go, learning through refraction. I'm going to take a couple of elements and try to use them or show how I've experimented with them in this. But that important idea of of using the learning for something, to do something. The importance of encounter as part of student formation. Pope Francis has spoken, of late extensively about encounter, but I kind of want to ask the question, like, where does that happen? Because it's sort of my sense after 20 years, working in Jesuit schools, that we often think that happens, that encounter happens sort of elsewhere. It's through the service program. It's through sort of another kind of a relationship that maybe is, for some reason, is not the one of the classroom amongst the familiar faces of the students. And I think we want to maybe explore that a little bit and maybe wonder together about if encounter can't happen here as much as it happens there. And in order to do that, I'm just going to sort of skip down one here. We're going to want to just pay attention, I guess, to the values of authenticity versus performance. And there, although I won't go into it very much or extensively, I want to talk a bit about the work of Erving Goffman. He was a sociologist, anthropologist who did work on face values and how in our culture, the face becomes a presentation of an image that we want to present to the world. And part of being human and operating in different sort of group public spaces is to learn how to present one's face in a way that has capital and that maximizes benefit for the individual. And he's not sort of critical of that. He notes that that's part of the processes of how these things work in terms of social life. What's interesting is when you think about the classroom space, and we all know how if one or two people kind of roll their eyes this way, or kind of as one student's making a comment, they, eye contact is made over this way, it can change the whole dynamic of that comment, the feeling, the affective sort of sense of that individual who's sharing. It can impact teachers, our feeling whether it's a good class or a bad class, were people with us or not. And often we see that as a sort of a separate economy, separate to what our job is in teaching students. And we just sort of, kind of, push through that. But we maybe want to begin with, the idea that that's something that we actually need to explore and name and shine a light on. And part of what we're going to do in trying to foster experiences of encounter is actually, work through that with our students. And we'll sort of talk a little bit more about that. The way we work through that is by developing listening communities in our classrooms. And these listening communities ultimately are what develop cultures of encounter. You can't, earmark where, when, and how an encounter will happen, what that means exactly. But the possibility of an encounter requires one to approach the other in a spirit of goodwill, the presupposition of goodwill, and also in an imaginative stance of the other's possibility itself. Like, how real I am to myself is how real you are to yourself. And if that can be real for me as well, and you're possible to me, then maybe that all immediately reshapes the way that I listen to you, or I'm open to engaging with you, and how I may process and hear what you say. And are they your words? Are they an expression that touches me, that's effective? Or is that what we mean by, prophetic utterances, or things that kind of have an impact beyond what the speaker even realizes? And how can we just experiment with bringing some of that into being in our classes? I think that's really an obligation we have as part of our mission. In that respect, with the lessons or the activities, I'll talk a little bit about, again, all is an experiment. I'm a big fan of experimentation and the idea that as teachers, we're constantly exploring and trying different things. I want to focus on, I mentioned Father Johnny Go and some of his work and his team's work, and how they talk about the reflection action phase within the IPP. And they talk about applying that in an in-context application. And so I want to suggest that the classroom be the in-context application. So we'll talk a bit about that. Very, very loosely, again, I haven't earmarked programmatically or prescriptively where and how I think these things will work or should work. Or I think as I imagine them, as I sort of envision my experiences with young people and what schools are like and the things going on in schools, I can see application for some of these experiments done in the ways that people may touch them through their personalities and styles, as useful for pre-service programs, getting students to think about others before or during part of their reflection in service trips. Again, that sort of puts it in the place of out there, but maybe part of new freshman onboarding, homeroom classes, building classroom cultures, grade level cultures, and starting that conversation about, how do we do what we do from the beginning, and trying to sort of shape that and be countercultural, because students, we know, I mean, they're coming into our rooms with this on their mind, and a lot of their social identities are constructed through the values of this. And so how do we start to really intentionally engage that and target that? And then, of course, various classes and other programs that may be happening in schools, I think, could be, interesting places to engage in some of this. I guess if there was a guiding sort of quote or idea for me, it would be this one by Proust. It's, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." And for me, again, that situates us in the local, in the immediacy of our classroom, as a place that encounter is possible. And I know, we know through the idea of pilgrimage itself, like this is, on all of our walks, the opportunity for encounter is there if we're there. And so we sometimes simply need new eyes. There's a Canadian Jesuit, Monty Williams, who says, we live through our imaginations as if they're real. And sometimes what we need is to see that as a way to imagine others and thus change our own realities. So some of the goals that we have for today, we want to talk about using AI to foster learning about perspective and bias. Talk about how we might apply that learning to foster greater recognition and authentic engagement with each other. And then how we might use AI to foster increased differentiation to support recognition and engagement. And again, that's sort of part of that second half of the presentation, if we can get to that. All right, so I'm going to share here just a sample activity. And the way that it's presented, again, utilizes some of the work that Father Johnny Go talks about. Talks about using insights to anchor our work in the classroom. And an insight is something that's debatable, deep diveable, and there's a third one that's escaped me, the 3Ds. Somebody else out there probably remembers it. In any case, it's lovely, and we'll go back to it. But the idea is that these insights don't necessarily need to be told to students in advance. Like, how do you know if students are coming to, through reflection, ideas that are in sync with the coherent construct of the classroom, the activities, the learning experiences, the resources selected, the methods of engagement in reflecting together in some kind of an action? How do we know that we've arrived at some place? And he talks about having an insight anchor activities. So one of the insights that we might use for this first activity, and this was one, it's a variation of one that someone shared actually in working with a cohort on the refracted, learning through refraction. But the insight is, what shapes our feelings and thoughts is often challenging to see and talk about. So that's kind of what we want students to discover. We want them to arrive at that insight, and or through the work we do together, insights in that constellation again, like they'll arrive at things that are their own, and then we can sort of evaluate how we constructed things based on where we thought they might get to and where they took things based on their own experiences and histories, and that's sort of the discovery of the classroom. So using that sort of insight, here's the first example activity. So we're going to explore perspective through ChatGPT, and maybe not necessarily finding bias. And the reason I sort of framed it that way is, when we approach the idea of finding bias with our students, we're almost beginning as if there's another position that is the unbiased or the right position. And the bias is immediately what telegraphs, something that's imbued with values and the unseen, and people don't, there's all these sort of negative connotations around bias. And so I think what's interesting is to explore the idea of perspective and how bias emerges out of different perspectives. So here's a question. I took something very timely, the events going on in the Middle East, and I asked ChatGPT to find bias in the following. And it was an example of a report of an exchange that Biden, some sharing that he had had with the Israeli Prime Minister. So ChatGPT immediately came back to me and said, the passage that you provided doesn't explicitly show bias in favor of either side. So again, immediately we're here. And neither the Israeli or Palestinian side, is sort of biased against in this particular excerpt. So, okay, that's interesting. Let's reframe. Let's regenerate our response. So how might someone who is pro-Palestinian find the following passage biased against Palestinians? So let's embed the question of bias within a perspective. And when we reframed that idea of bias and in relation to a perspective, suddenly ChatGPT said, well, here's how it could be seen. Here's what's possible. Again, the idea of something debatable, something that one might investigate further. It requires more. So it's not the answer. It's something that opens a gateway to inquiry for our students. And it provides a number of ways in which this position, this perspective may experience or see bias. So then I said, okay, well, ChatGPT originally told me that there was no bias in favor of Israel or Palestine, and now it's saying that there may be for the Palestinian side. And so how might someone who is pro-Israel find the following passage biased against Israel? And ChatGPT once again comes back and says, well, here's how. And again, this is how it may. And we already know that ChatGPT itself inherently expresses bias. So their studies have shown that there's a left-leaning liberal bias to some of its political commentaries or responses, that there are racial, gendered biases in the way that it assumes pronouns or assumes characters in scenarios. So we know these exist, and we already have sort of in I think our first webinar, we spoke about how we need to make ChatGPT and make AI the subject of our learning with students to make those biases clear. But there's more at play here. I think now what we're trying to do is we're trying to use this tool to generate possibilities that may not immediately be accessible to our imaginations or the imaginations of our students, and see how it can provide a fullness, a richness of possibility that might be useful in a way that we can do something with. And I want to make clear, we're not trying to do finding the right answer here. We're not trying to sort of arrive at which side is the right side. What we would actually then do, I would suggest, is present a personal reflection opportunity to our students. And again, we're here going back to the insight that we wanted to draw out of our students, right? How are complicated histories, complicated lived experiences, sometimes seen or unseen in the ways that we feel and we think? And so one possible way of framing a reflection question is, what may have shaped the perspectives that led to the biases identified? Is there a clear answer to this question? And so students are to grapple with on their own just that idea of what might people go through. Again, what we're aiming at is for students to discover and fill in this idea of the possible, using the faculty of imagination, not necessarily of reason. This isn't a debate. It's not a research topic. We're trying to get them to explore the possibility of these perspectives. And then we might shift the personal reflection into a discussion to explore insights. Again, we might reveal through the conversation what the guiding insight was, or how we had, make transparent how we had kind of thought the construct of this experience might go, be moved by how students provide other insights, and just let there be a real fertility and a real dynamism to what comes forth from that. Again, this is sort of one step. What we want to kind of look at is how, although we know that there are biases expressed, and I sort of mentioned this already, we want to acknowledge that AI may serve to compose scenarios that may be useful. So we're back to that principle of take what's useful and make use of it, and discard what isn't. And so here's an opportunity to explore what may be useful in a different way than we'd considered with AI. Now, where might this first activity go? Because we haven't really done anything with it yet at the level of the classroom. Our students have individually started to kind of engage their own thoughts and then shared some of that. So our next movement in this might be something like this. The insight that guides this would be: representations of identities cannot contain the mystery and fullness of people's realities. There's more to everyone. And what this insight is trying to lead students to is a discovery of what Goffman talked about in terms of face values and how we present ourselves. And everybody thinks that they're more than what people might assume of them. But that doesn't always translate into us being generous in the way that we sort of think of others or approach the possibility of other people. It's just one of these sort of contradictions of our being stuck in ourselves, you know? And so can we guide students to some of that discovery? We talked a little bit about the two sides. They'd imagined those experiences. Let's kind of turn things a little more inward here. So the next activity the instructions would be something like this. We'd have AI generate an opinion on any current or historical event from the perspective of the student. So rather than trying to imagine the other and trying to take that step of the perspective of activity one further, let's kind of shift it to imagining our own positionality, our own experiences. So we then would enter something into the AI, and we'd see what we get back, and then we'd evaluate that. We'd ask ourselves, is the perspective or the biases that are sort of present in whatever has been produced, are they accurate? What's missing? Do I see myself reflected back, mirrored back in the generative process, this AI tool that has read the internet and has taken all kinds of elements? Has it presented back to me something that contains me? And we kind of would hypothesize that the answer is probably going to be no. And if it's yes, we might explore that too. But then we would challenge students to kind of continue regenerating, add more criteria, add different sort of qualities of what you think are your identity, and see if that leads to what you think is your voice. And once students kind of do that, our follow-up would be, again, moving into reflection. This time we would move into small group to do some debrief, and then we would look at using a circle for whole class sharing. Now, I want to say a couple things about this before we move on. Well, this is actually, before I do, this is an example. I just sort of threw this together. Write an opinion piece from the perspective of a 47-year-old son of Italian immigrants on residential schools and the obligation of the state to compensate victims. This could seem like a no-brainer in some respects from an ethical sort of moral position. But I was on an airplane, not too long ago, and was horrified at a conversation that I overheard where people were talking about this. And again, there is no one way that people experience any sort of ethical problem. In Australia, they just had a major referendum, national, and they voted not to recognize different aspects of the Aboriginal experience there, although the Aboriginal population voted in favor of it. And so, things are complicated. But in this example, which would reflect some of my own identity elements, I could look at this, read what's provided, and say, well, yeah, maybe I think that, or what if I don't know if I agree with that, and I might test this out further to get some sense. Now, I want to kind of shift a little to the importance of teaching our method, right? Specifically, so when we're talking about using circles, or maybe even building our work with small groups, circles require guidelines. And this is an example of 4 guideline elements that I've used, and we write them on a sheet of paper, we put them in the center of the circle, and we discuss them before we get going. And these are to kind of keep our focus. And we usually start with simple circles, some light sharing circles. We build to circles that require greater degrees of trust because of the potential vulnerability of what's shared in terms of how we feel or think about complicated topics, messy topics. But we don't want to shirk away from messy topics. But 4 of those elements would be, guidelines would be: focus on listening, one speaker at a time. And sometimes circles will use a talking piece, and that comes out of a restorative justice tradition there. The third one that I really like is eyes turn to wonder. And that leads to a really explicit conversation with students about body language, communication, how we communicate with each other in nonverbal ways, and just trying to again, shine a light on that, and then provide some accountability to the way that we're going to now behave with each other. And this is the beginning of our translation from our learning to our doing. And then their 4th criteria or guideline, is that students can pass. They have a choice. They can sort of bear witness to the circle and we do a round. We always loop back at the end, and did anybody who passed want to share at this point? We want space for extroverts. We want time and space for introverts to reflect and then synthesize an idea and then express. We often, in preparation for doing circles, talk about different personality types and the challenges for each, again, on the spectrum of introversion and extroversion. And then you might adapt rounds of this. You, again, like spiritual conversation that follows a sort of a rounds style. Now that one has intermittent sort of reflection and prayer, and it's a little different in the classroom space. But again, a bit of silence goes a long way, and you might only kind of experiment with, you know, a one round to begin with, and then build a stamina for something like this. But you typically begin with, you know, what did you feel? Based on the activity, based on your learning, based on what you discovered, the insight you came to. Again, we don't always start up here. We typically tend to start over here. So what did you feel about? And again, it's wide open. And it's not a conversation at this point. It is each person, as with spiritual conversation, sharing what their experience was. The second round moves from the heart to the mind, heart to the head. And so now, what did you think? So again, some people just want to dive into the rationalization process and what they experienced and all this type of thing. And then the third round is, now let's respond to each other. So one thing that moved us, and that may come from what somebody said they felt, what somebody said that they thought, what moved us in either heart or head. And so we might use something like that to do a sharing where we're talking now about how much we felt our identities had been captured or conveyed through this AI tool, and what does that say about us and about our identities and about the nature of our experiences and perspectives in defining who we are and how we see ourselves. And again, we're talking about the I here, but it's like that handy thing I love, that t-shirt I saw somewhere, I think it was in Scranton, Ignatius, it starts with an I, but it ends with an us, right? So the idea here is to move us to the us. Couple of quick notes on the idea of the circle here. There are different kinds of circles. We talked a bit about that. You can start with very light sort of experiences here. They do require work. They do require investment. They require reshaping the classroom space to some degree. But it's going slow to go fast as your class builds experience with this kind of sharing. One of the two sort of key elements I might also share is that ultimately students are trained to facilitate the circle. So as a whole, this is whole class instruction. This is, what does it mean to redirect? What does it mean to ask probing questions? What does it mean to imagine when silence is needed versus when offering something is needed? And what's the role of the facilitator exactly anyways? The facilitator's role is not to get to the right answer. It's not even to get to the product. The product in this case is the process. The facilitator's role is to ensure a safe and an equitable space for all participants to choose to speak and for others to listen. So working on that at the front end is really, really important. And then where possible, teachers should participate in circles as members of the community. When I've done circles, there are times that I sit in circle and I share and I'm quiet and I wait for the facilitator to work their magic. And then at the end of that process, I'll pull facilitators to the side and use it as an opportunity for formative engagement. I'll talk a bit about how they facilitated and did they notice this or notice that, and feedback, because we try to build facilitation into the way we do small groups, and suddenly we multiply how many facilitators we have, and suddenly sharing in a group means something a little different. And the way that we design our groups is less by, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or this row, this row, this row, but we're kind of intentionally now thinking about personality types and styles, and we're trying to give opportunity in some of the groups that we may put together. And so there's a lot of dynamics at play in using this sort of a method. Now, what do we want the learning to do? So now we want to move now from the I to the us. And here's where we start back up with another insight. The insight we want to ultimately apply to ourselves is the insight that we hope will shine the light on what Goffman suggested about the faces we use in our classrooms, in our social encounters. We want to suggest the insight that representations of identity don't contain the mystery and the fullness of our realities. There's more to everyone, and there's an intentional sort of play on the magis there. And if there can be more, I used to say about the classroom, we often enter the classroom like the last time I saw you is the next time I see you. And sometimes when we have great relationships with our students, they might love that. I love Miss or Sir or whoever. And sometimes if the relationship is tense, it's like, I got to go back. And what's the struggle with that? Well, they already think this of me, and I think this of them. And we hardly ever, I mean, it's a real beautiful thing if we're able to open that up into a conversation. But often we just live through those roles. So again, this insight that there's more is something that has a lot of power. It carries a lot of weight in possibly reshifting our perspective and our eyes in the way that we start to share with each other, the way we start to listen and hear each other, the way we're moved through what we hear to imagine new elements to the perspectives of others that we previously had not considered at all, because we just ascribed them to some social category or group in our school, and that's what they are as much as who they are. And so that's sort of an important part of the process. Now, what would we do to do that exactly? Well, I think having the kinds of groups that I described earlier is one step, but also just looking to assess, not measure, but to assess changes in the dynamics of the culture of our room, taking the temperature, the sort of mission health, pH of our classroom. Is facilitation being engaged authentically, or is it becoming more a part of group dynamics? And this will take time. This isn't like a 1 day, 2 day. There's probably gonna be skepticism, in some respects and in some circles around this, and in the sharing, How does listening change within our sharing? Do we notice that? Let's ask our students. Let's give them anonymous feedback forms and ask them how they're experiencing the process, and do they feel that it adds anything? To what degree does that intangible feeling of relationships in our classroom change? And so we want to monitor for these things, because this is where the learning that does something is happening. And what is it doing? It's trying to create, as a learning community, the emergence of a learning community is trying to create an opportunity for encounter to become possible. Will it many times? Who knows? That's sort of, again, there's seeds we plant that we may never see the fruit of. But the point is, if we're not actively asking how this is happening and how it may be happening, there's even less of a chance that it happens. And so, I would suggest that it's something that sort of called upon us, or that we're called to. Again, so what do we want to learn? So another way that we might actualize this in the classroom, starting the year off, or from that point of that conversation around people are more than what they may appear. Again, and you could have done that with a poem in the class, and you could have just said that. But framing it with an insight, through an insight that people have to discover, using AI to explore scenarios that are multiple, having students actively involved in creating scenarios of perspectives that they might be interested in or curious about, creating spaces to have conversations around that leads to a kind of a learning that's much more tangible. And a follow-up activity at this point could be sitting everybody together again and saying, okay, so if we're really being honest now, what do you need from yourself to be your best in this space, to do your best? And then what do you need from others? And then a sharing of that. And I've done this with quite a few classes. And the honesty that comes up is often really interesting. And what students name is really telling, because students will name. I need people not to judge when students make comments in class. I need people to actually slow down, and even though they might think they have the answer, to slow down and let people have a chance to process before they offer answers to the questions. And these are things that get shared, and the sharing of it introduces and opens a degree of vulnerability, because a conversation ensues and people start to wonder about, why did that person say they need that, or they need that from themselves? And so again, that wondering is really important here. But what this leads to is the co-creation, the possibility that we co-create class norms and values in our class that become the foundation of accountability to and with each other, as opposed to and shifting away from the obligation to class rules. And that's not to say that rules don't have a place in classes and schools, obviously they do. But our classrooms as learning communities, people should be doing things for reasons more than just the attachment to a fear of punishment or an obligation to what the rule is. And so again, what are we doing to engender that, to enable that and explore that together with our students? And again, I would be very metacognitive with my students and naming this process and being very transparent about it, because I want them to be part of what we're trying to build in the room. Ultimately, you're trying to make it all a part of the water. So we began with AI, but simply put, how do we use AI for mission values and to create a mission healthy environment? We wrap the human all around the AI. AI is not in a position yet, and if it ever will be, to sustain the doing of that on its own. It's a tool at this point, and a limited one in some respects. But again, we can sort of ask ourselves questions and naming the changes that we want. So this is an image that Father Johnny Go provided, and I think it's a really good one. And it's, again, part of the way that I sort of am thinking about this. He talked about the transfer of learning, and how students can do really, really well academically up here, and say, as an example, writing essays about promoting social justice, but they don't bother to activate that in action, whether it's as simple as following with the news, or whether it's participating in the school's garden club or composting, or but there's some delay, some kind of break between the doing of school, the learning part, with then the translation into action. And I'd like to suggest that, again, when we think about creating spaces of encounter in our classrooms, moving from just imagining that those spaces are there, but rather they're also here, that's the process of transferring the learning to the action within the space, the accountability within the space of the classroom itself. And I do think that AI, and in this case, ChatGPT, is a really, really handy tool for just creating case studies and scenarios and possibilities to be dealt with through the imagination. So I'll take a little pause here. I don't know if there are any questions, but we're at about 37 minutes, from sort of more than halfway through. But this would be a time if anyone has questions on this first half. I don't want to rush through the second half. My fear would be that there would be questions we might not get to there, but if there's nothing here, we can go on. So just, all right, I know I've said a lot. Thank you for your patience with me. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, so I'll take that as let's kind of proceed, and I'll try to be efficient and see if we can leave some time. So, all right, so part two is, again, using AI to foster greater differentiation as an act of recognition. So there's a way of talking about DI and DA as just, best teaching practices and things that we need to do for student learning. But in a faith-based school, in our context, we do that also to recognize the dignity of each person fully in terms of responding to their needs, right? We start with cura personalis. What are the needs of the individual, understood in a myriad of ways? And so how does this add to that? A quick anecdote, a couple of years ago, guidance at the school that I was at came up with an accommodations plan, a learning plan for a student. The student was supposed to get certain accommodations, again, not defined by me, but defined through guidance, for learning in the classroom as well as assessments. What happened was, because it just was such a burden, a time burden to kind of do like chunk things and produce, get copies of notes and get the speech to text software for every class so the student could be up on what they were doing in the moment. Teachers just kind of resorted to, are you okay if we just do this? And putting the student in a really uncomfortable position of having to kind of name their need repeatedly in the face of what clearly was kind of like, can we try this a different way this time? And by the time we got to the term exam, the student's parent came forward and said, in reflecting together with my daughter, it was clear that she only received the accommodations for the exam. That was like the first time in ages that she'd actually utilized these. And when we brought this conversation to teachers, the response from teachers was, well, well, she had an 86. Like, look how good she was doing. So the 86 was proof that she didn't need the accommodations. And the father's response, I thought, was quite telling. And sort of what he said was, well, imagine what she might have done if all along she'd been receiving what she needed. And we know that our schools have an obligation to provide these things, especially when the accommodations come through guidance and are accompanied with, different diagnoses, et cetera. But it's not always easy still to recognize students and to live through that. So we can support different learners and save our teacher time. It's a bit of time on the front end, but again, we invest in the front end to go slow later on. We go slow here to go fast later, sorry. But we can use AI to chunk. And again, so for kids with attention challenges, we limit how much is present in certain parts of our assessments or in the work they're using in the classroom. We scaffold for some students. For different cognitive reasons, students need some assistance in approaching problems. So they need even more help in that metacognitive understanding of how they think about their thinking for an answer. They may need changes in reading levels. Maybe, they weren't held back at any point in grade school or middle school, but their reading level in 10th grade is, maybe not at that level. And so they get stumped sometimes with the essays or the reading pieces, because they're working through what some of the things mean. And so having access to a dictionary or having access to a slightly modified version of a reading level, same content, same idea, same argument, but may give them a better chance for success. On the other end of things, it may add challenge questions for enrichment. It can take an assessment that is made for the class and say, okay, now I want you to make me a copy or another version of this assessment where you actually remove some of the specificity of two of the short answers, and let's add a challenge question as well. And AI can take that and synthesize all kinds of different suggestions, and you can kind of select the one that fits the best for you and copy and paste it, and there you go. At this stage, we are still working with copy and paste, unfortunately, when it comes to modifying our own assessments. So AI can generate assessments for us, and then we can ask it to continue regenerating formats that are consistent with what we need. But it can't take something that's ours and maintain or give us back a format that's immediately usable. I was dealing with a web developer of Hamada, which is the tool that helps with the practice of metacognitive learning skills I'll talk about briefly. And when we talked about, like, do you have something that does this, or can your tool do this? And he was like, no, but that would be amazing. And that's what I mean by AI isn't quite there yet. But as we express our needs, these tools may evolve and change, and it may be possible at one point to throw your assessment into an AI tool and say, here are the ways I need this assessment. These are the 3 ways I need this differentiated. And AI can just immediately do that in total, and you kind of print them off. At this stage, you need to do it in segments and then repiece it together. But you don't have to build the whole thing on your own. But ChatGPT and Hamada are 2 tools that I think I'll refer to. Tango is another interesting one that you can annotate and allow students to follow your thought process through an assessment, and there's blocks they click on to get sort of hints or your sort of teaching moments of the process. But it's not as developed as it may end up being soon. So that may be one to kind of think about. But here's just a couple of examples I'll provide. Again, getting AI to create the assessment and getting it to do that in a way that chunks and scaffolds. And so here you have an example. In this case, it chunked 3 questions per page, and then it scaffolded the 2 questions. And I could have asked it to separate the 2 questions and then provide line space for completing answers and all kinds of stuff, and see what it can produce for me, or copy paste it and modify the format myself. But in this case, we have the prompting of the scaffold, right? So students may not immediately know where to begin in the question itself, and so the instructions there provide them with, okay, start with this information, then talk a bit about this, and then go there. And some people, some of us may go like, is that giving it away? Well, I mean, the student still has to know what all of those are and explain them. And some of the accommodations that I've encountered in my time is that students can receive clarification of questions. They can receive, and clarification of question can mean offering a scaffolded approach to what the question is asking. So again, it's the degree of need of the student that we want to use in guiding what we create. So in this case, what I did was I took a test. This was a social studies test, and I think it was a social studies test. And I said, okay, I want you to take this test, and I want you to do this with it. So again, I didn't want AI to generate some new assessment. I wanted to use something that was authentic to what I had immediately taught in the classroom. So the questions were tied to class conversations and engagements. But I wanted it to format, suggest scaffolding for questions, change the difficulty level of the vocabulary, in brackets, modify or provide synonyms for difficult vocab words. So I tried 3 or 4 different variations, and each time with chunks, AI was able to do something that I could easily have copied and pasted. And all of a sudden, I made the first test, and now with AI, 15 minutes later, I had 5 versions of the one test. So that's another example. Again, this is just sort of the chunking, adding parenthetical hints. And then here's an example of more scaffolding. Right? And again, you can engage and modify this, but you see this was based on an essay by Stephen King, about horror and the genre of horror, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's kind of giving cues, even prompts. So remember what figurative language is, so this might be, middle school or maybe freshman who's struggling with some things and has certain accommodations. And so there's ways of scaffolding and also teaching, or at least reinforcing, the writing process. This is how you write up an analytical paragraph. Here's how you annotate, and then are led to using those annotations in a piece of writing. And so it can break that process down. And you might only end up using 1 short answer question instead of 3. Ultimately, you're testing the skill of the writing, the skill of the reading, and the synthesis between those two. And so do you need 3? Can you do 1? Can you do 2? Can you stretch one out over another class? Again, these are questions we can ask, but the tool can help us generate the material. And here's an example of Hamada. So on the one side, you have a bio midterm exam, a 12th grade midterm exam, a senior exam. And here the teacher is going to use a copy of an old exam as a teaching tool with the student in anticipation of getting to the actual exam process and exam period. And they're going to use Hamada to read the PDFs and then respond to questions that we can ask and prompted to ask about the PDF content. So in this case, Hamada immediately surveys the piece, says this is a bio midterm. It has multiple choice. It has questions. 3 example questions that could be asked are 1, 2, and 3. But then the question that I asked, and if I'm the teacher working with a student, I'm trying to train the student on how to ask these kinds of questions so that when they use the tool, what they're focused on is building a metacognitive understanding, building a vocabulary, and building a kind of scaffolding and experience of how to get to the answering these questions on their own as far as they are able to get. And so in this case, it was, how do I start answering a question about X? So the student struggles with initiating ideas. Once they get going, they're able to kind of, spiral one thought after another. But based on, for a couple of different reasons, the student struggles with idea generation. And so we can use an AI tool like this in the context of an actual assessment, the quality of which, the difficulty level of which is appropriate to the classroom, to have that student build and work on learning skill development. And so Hamada is another tool, I think that's an excellent one, that can be used as part of conferencing. It can be used as homework. It can be assigned to students and have them come in. And again, what you're evaluating is the nature of the questions that were asked. And then through discussion, okay, where would you begin and how would you now take what Hamada offered to write something? And now maybe independent of the screen, let's have you go write a response to that question as it was sort of begun for you using this tool. And so we're still trying to provide students with opportunities to write and to work independently. But I think we need to sort of get over this feeling that we sometimes have, which is that if AI provides something, suddenly that somehow that's it's not valid to what the student's doing in the classroom. It's valid to their needs for learning and where they can get to through the support of this AI tool. And equal doesn't always mean the same, right? Or equity doesn't always mean the same. So I think, why would we experiment with tools like ChatGPT, with Hamada? They're time consuming, especially at their stage of development right now, but they help us discover the right fit. And when we start to explore how differentiation can be used or arrived at through resources using these tools, and then we engage students and we recognize their needs, and we make that part of what the engagement of needs in the classroom are, we start to affirm difference. We start to affirm the relative nature of our successes in some ways, right? It's my 72 may have been really hard fought, and I shouldn't have to feel like that 72 is terrible and that I'm not good enough and I'm not worthy enough because it's not a 94. And in some of our high achieving schools and classes, it's ironic, but that experience of kids that are really self-directed, highly motivated, very intellectually capable, often can be an alienating experience for students who struggle. And so finding tools to help them find that success and affirm that through recognition, I would argue, is another aspect of what we said in topic 1, which was trying to build mission healthy classes. Classes that function and operate based on values consistent with mission, and also learning of values that can be transferred into doing. So the way our classrooms become much more able to sustain the differentiation experience, both of the teachers, but also of the students themselves, I think is a testament to how healthy our classrooms are. And not falling victim to, being good in school equals a number. And we know that that's antithetical to what our mission and values are. So that's sort of a nutshell of that second part of the presentation. We have a few minutes for some questions. I don't know if anybody, if you have some questions, you're welcome to put them into the chat at this time, and we can explore some things together. All right, thank you. The question is, how can we encourage teachers in a traditional school setting to adopt a more positive, open-minded perspective towards AI, especially when many of them may initially dismiss it as lacking validity or relevance? That's a really great question, and I think this speaks to the always present question of teacher change, of adult learning, of growth mindset. I think one of the ways that we have to engage with teachers in traditional settings at times is by, I think, one, naming what our philosophy of education is and affirming that applies to the institution. And that philosophy of learning doesn't state that AI is necessary or is the next required thing in our classrooms, but it says that we need to be open to growth and to exploring the usefulness, the utility of what's in our current culture, and then not using what isn't useful. I think the real test becomes how departments are empowered, whether it's through instructional coaches that may be in schools or through department heads, classroom visits, in a formative way, not in an evaluative way, not in a way that's tied to a teacher's evaluation for the year, but in terms of setting goals for the year, setting goals for the department as much as the individual. Having some of those goals be self-directed in terms of the teachers, like I want to just do better with this year. It was in my student feedback last year, so that's what I want to target. And goals that are tied to department and institution-wide. And I think then connecting the tools that we're exploring to what we try to do here, which is those mission values. So again, we're not necessarily saying that in a traditional English classroom that AI is you need to use it to help students learn how to write essays or to do X, Y, or Z. In some respects, what we're saying is we're actually going to park that consideration, that purely academic consideration, and we will defer to the specialization of teachers and the, in conversation with their departments and where people are in terms of how flexible they feel or how open to growth and change they may be. And those are dynamic conversations that are all grounded in healthy relationships. So I think investing in the health of relationships is the first step. Getting to a place of this kind of dialogue is the second step. Having structures in our institutions that invite teachers into that change, ideally done in an extended way that has follow-up. So it's not like that PD you had one day and like, okay, go off and try this and I'll see you in 4 months, let me know how it went. Change never happens that way, right? But a lot of our schools now are investing in different structures. So in instructional coaches, in design specialists, and those people will work with faculty members, not in telling people what to do, but what do you want to try to do with this tool? And it's that discussion and then trying to see if the tool can do the thing that we're exploring. The other thing that I would suggest maybe a positive step would be when we know that there are teachers in our buildings who are using AI in non-traditional ways, or if there is a traditional AI method, but using AI to maybe challenge traditional methods or in interesting ways to support mission healthy classroom environments or academic pursuits. I think it's also incumbent on departmental leads and leadership in our schools to get people moving, have them, if you may be skeptical or you may kind of hear what I'm expressing about the use of circles in my classrooms, but if you come into my classroom and if there's a vitality to what you're seeing, and if you kind of look at that and you say, again, it's no different than what we were trying to do with the AI in terms of making something possible that was previously impossible, right? And maybe extending that presupposition of goodwill instead of shutting things down right away. So maybe, affirming our kind of values that way, but getting into our classrooms and seeing where there are successes, but also having post-reflection conversations with teachers who are experimenting so that they can talk about, where did things go well? Where did this struggle? Where did the tool not work in the way that I thought it might work? And I think as we can continue to do that, what we hopefully will do is we'll start to really move our teachers' mindsets from one in which we're the masters and the depositors of our mastered knowledge to like we're the experimenters, we're the coaches, we're any number of the different constructs of what a teacher can be in today's day and age, in today's culture. And then sort of just investing in that at every opportunity. So again, I mentioned that group that Father Johnny Go had done through the JSN a while back. And anytime something like that is available, I think having a group of teachers within a school commit to trying some of those things, creating time at a staff meeting or at an academic divisional to share, having student data feedback to qualify what students are going through. It's hard for teachers who are skeptical to get some data results where students are saying, this was really awesome. Like this, I had a student say to me one time when we did a cross-curricular activity between English and math, and we used that Erving Goffman stuff and our circle stuff, and we worked through some skepticism in the first couple classes. By the time we finished that unit, I had a student who was often sort of disengaged, et cetera, come up to me at the end of one class and say to me, sir, why haven't we been talking about this stuff before? Like this is kind of what matters. When we got to the part about shining a light on the way that students present themselves, and students then could actively seek to have voice in that and to have be heard in that and feel that their school was supporting that was very powerful for that student. So having some of that in your data collection and sharing that amongst faculty also may go a step in the right direction. So again, there's no sort of one way I think to encourage, but I think it's a cultural shift It's definitely a paradigm shift in some respects, but it has to be coordinated. I think we have to invite our school leadership, and not just leadership as in people in positions of authority, but teachers in the school who have leadership, who are able to move things and move people forward. I think there are strategic conversations that we explore to then bring things to others in that way. So build capacity, I think. Well, I hope that addresses that question to some degree. Thank you very much for it. I really do appreciate it. That concludes our time together. I want to sort of respect our time. It's now 1 hour since our start time. Thank you for joining us. I know this was a lot. There was a lot of content in this. We will share the video recording of this if people want to, review anything. And if you happen to do that and questions pop up at a later time, please reach out to me. I'd be more than open to having a conversation.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.